Hello, this is Jeff Becker of the Tepper School of Business. I'm here today with Lars Hansen and Ken Singleton, who are being honored with a conference at the Tepper School called Advances in Theory-Based Estimation. Joining us as guest host is Rick Green, the Richard M. and Margaret S. Syrett Professor of Economics and Management and Chairman of the Tepper School's PhD program. Welcome. This conference commemorates the 25th anniversary of Hansen's and Singleton's seminal paper, Generalized Instrumental Variables Estimation of Nonlinear Rational Expectations Models, published in 1982 in the journal Econometrica. While the title of their paper may be a bit abstract, its impact is anything but. The models Lars and Ken estimated are the centerpiece of modern dynamic analysis in business and economics and are widely considered to be one of the most important milestones in empirical economic analysis. Lars is currently the Homer J. Livingston Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago, and Ken is the Adams Distinguished Professor of Management at Stanford University. But both were working here at the Tepper School in the early 1980s when they produced this path-breaking research. With that, let me turn it over to Rick for our interview.
Well, thanks for showing up, and that's a lot of distinguished. I'm very impressed with all the distinguished.
It's a sign of age.
So I thought it would be nice to talk a little bit first about how you got here and what it was like here when you were here, and then we can talk about the research that we're here commemorating. So, Lars, you got here first.
Yes, I did.
Why did you come here?
So, I came here in 1978. Carnegie Mellon chose to interview me before the meetings. You know, the way that hiring goes on in economics, there are these meetings which the candidates fly to and get interviewed at. Carnegie invited me before the meetings, and they were generous enough to make me an offer. And no other place after the meetings made me an offer. So my choice set was one, and it turned out to be a very good choice. I was very lucky. There were people like, like Dennis Apple and heading their junior recruiting committee that in spite of the fact my research wasn't very far along, so were able to see through, I guess, a little bit of potential and like that. And so things worked out.
You think they were able to identify you because young people were heavily involved in recruiting?
Oh, absolutely. There were very few senior faculty members involved at all, and the recruiting was done by the junior faculty, and they were very open to. I think they saw a set of skills that weren't well represented at the school at the time, and they were kind of open to taking a gamble, I guess.
The other econometricians who were here when you got here were who? And what sort of work did they do?
It was Bob Avery was here. He was more in kind of a micro cross-sectional analysis. I guess I'm trying to think that's probably principally the one.
And then one of the things that was remarkable for me when I showed up here was how much in evidence you were here, even though you weren't anymore. That is, you had all these students and all these co-authors. I was running into your ideas everywhere. What was it about the environment that made this such a natural match for you?
I think all the junior faculty here at the time this was, when I got there, this was just before people like Harris and Townsend and Apple and Kidlin got tenure. And it was all this feeling, oh my gosh, we don't have any senior faculty, we must be missing something. But of course it was a very incredible junior faculty, and the junior faculty were very interactive, and they weren't into their own thing. They're anxious to learn about what was going on with others, and so that meant I could go and learn finance from people like Scott Richard, and I could learn economic dynamics from people like Milton Harris and Rob Townsend, and they were also willing to learn. So there's lots of interaction, and I think that was it allowed me to get to know a lot of people, and I gained a lot from that.
So, and Ken, you left an economics department. You were both from big economics departments as graduate students, and then you were at Virginia.
That's right.
And so how did you hook up with people here?
The usual process of running into people at conferences and getting to know about people and their work, and then Lars and Rob Townsend started talking with me about the idea of moving to Carnegie, and in 1980 they made me an offer, and I moved up here as an assistant professor and joined into the fray of all the other As Lars says, largely young people at the time. It was, as Lars said, a very interactive group, sort of a constant engagement in ideas in the hallways, on runs in Schenley Park. At lunch, almost every day, the group would go out to lunch. But in addition to that, there was a sort of a tradition or culture of sitting in on other people's courses. So it wasn't merely a hallway sort of chit chat. We were frequently sitting in on each other's PhD courses. There may have been almost as many faculty as there were PhD students in some of the courses. That sort of fueled the post session discussions in hallways and exchange of ideas across the board. So you tended to wander across fields that were a bit far from what you may have been, or areas of your field that you were trained in, and that I think promoted a lot of interaction in ways that led people to think about questions outside the box, away from the kind of the mainstream or norm of what people were thinking about at the time.
Did it seem risky to you to leave a good economics department and come here, where the economics group was much smaller and it was mixed up in this confusing way with the business school?
I was unsure about what it was going to be like to be in a business school, but in terms of joining the economics department, not at all. I mean, I saw it as an opportunity. This culture was in some ways an opportunity to be moving to an excellent research environment, but in some ways also going back to school. There was a group of people here that were trained at different places than where I had been trained, so they came at things from a very different perspective, and so I was among those who were very anxious to be sitting on everybody's classes to see a different perspective on economics. Even though I was trained in economics, the training was actually quite different. So it was an eye-opener for me, and I think that also contributed to encouraging one. Just even developing a language to communicate encourages one to think outside of your own training and look at things differently. And hopefully that was went both ways, and so it was just a terrific environment in that regard. Yeah.
At this point in time, there are kind of two places. I think of two places that were really known for being potentially good places for junior faculty. And that was Meds at Northwestern, which had an incredible stream of people go through there, and Carnegie. I mean, it just had a reputation that we're going to be nice to the young people. And
so Meds, a lot of its early faculty were from Carnegie Mellon.
Yep. There were connections between the two. Absolutely, right. Absolutely. And those are two very special environments for young people.
Mm-hmm. So then, how did you find each other? Were you working at all with each other before Ken came?
My recollection is that we met at a Econometrica Society conference in Montreal and got to know each other over lunch there.
Right. That's right.
And I was aware of his work before that, and so I knew of him. Yeah. But that's the first time I really got to know him. But I think our work only got going after Ken came
you were
here.
Both here.
That's right. Yeah, mm-hmm. we were, as Lars says, obviously aware of what each other was doing, and I was front and center in his econometrics class when I arrived mm-hmm. to sit through and try to better understand the GMM framework and what he had done in his dissertation and what he was currently working on. Mm-hmm. And then we got to brainstorming, but I think also it was brainstorming about issues related to sort of macro and finance and econometrics. But I think we're also very much influenced by the environment here of our colleagues who were thinking about financial economics in different ways than certainly I had been thinking about them, and that led us to be looking at macro, or my background, econometrics and finance, and mix it all up and bring it together in the ways we ended up working on it.
Lars, you were working with lots of people on lots of applied problems, kind of bringing this technology to bear. These papers with Ken, I think, are sort of remarkable in that the match is just so natural. The asset pricing applications. Did you see that kind of immediately? Did this seem to you like when you were working on the early drafts, like this is going to be just terrific stuff, or were you just fumbling your way through research, and happy that it worked out so well.
So kind of my recollections of the origins of this was Ken had told me about this paper of Grossman and Schiller. It's there's a more extended paper than the one that eventually got published in Papers and Proceedings, and that kind of got thinking about this set of problems. Ken was saying, well, can't we think about this in the way that we'd like to think about estimation? But I don't. At any point in time, we didn't really. We were worried about getting it published in a journal. We weren't worried about whether it could be a big paper or not.
That's right.
Well, it now suddenly occurs to me that Schiller came to Wisconsin and gave a talk, and he was still reeling from some visit he had made here. So that may have been part of the because he talked about how critical people had been and unsympathetic to his approach and so on when he was here.
I think he should have put it on a more positive light. I mean, there's just no doubt his work. I mean, it's obviously we approach it formally differently, but it's got thinking about this whole class of models and their implications. I mean, his and Sandy's work was just central.
Yeah, they posed a very interesting question and puzzle and challenge. One that it was equally frustrating for us in the sense of the way they had looked at things along deterministic paths and done the calculations and reached perhaps it seemed like strong conclusions without taking into account all the dynamics and the stochastic framework. That was a catalyst for us to start brainstorming and wrestling with the issues and think about whether there's a different and better way to look at the problem.
In terms of the substantive findings, this has kind of gone down in history as part of the equity premium puzzle.
Yes.
Did you think there was any chance this thing would fit? That is, the paper's been influential as the first of many, many, many failed attempts to get the model to fit.
You mean before we did our empirical work?
Yes.
Did we think it had a chance?
Were you naive about this, or did you have some sense that did you expect when the J statistic showed up and was huge? Was this something you expected, or you just had no idea?
I don't know if we went with strong priors. I mean, I think that I think we were intrigued by the question of what happens when you look at things with conditional expectations rather than the somewhat more deterministic way that Grossman and Schiller looked at things. I think we were intrigued by the different levels of risk aversion that come out of accommodating the dynamics as we were doing versus looking just at the first moments and finding that you need substantial, much higher risk aversion parameters to get things to match up.
Because this was going on simultaneously with Mehra and Prescott, is that right, or how?
Yeah, I saw Mehra Prescott's work later, but
later, yeah.
I mean, the origins may well have been earlier, but we saw it later.
I guess I remember more of as we were in the working paper form, as we were traveling around and presenting the paper and at conferences, the reactions of. I guess I remember a bit more being put on the defensive in the sense of why would you ever look at there were a class of macroeconomists wondering why we'd even look at a model and look at it this way, and I recall frequently trying to motivate the interest in looking at simple models formally to understand how well they do or do not work, and then from that try to better understand what directions one needs to go in. So it was a mixed reception at the time, actually, to what we were doing, I think.
And the pushback from the finance community, they were sort of focused on the cross-sectional behavior. Yeah. Is that accurate? How did they absorb this at the time?
I don't Lars? I don't remember strong reactions.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of came at this from more of a macroeconomics background because I was, at the same time of writing this paper, I was also trying to learn some finance. I had previously done this work with Bob Hodrick about exchange rates, but there was kind of no rule for investor preferences or anything else in that. It was kind of it was more trying to understand the existing evidence on predictability of exchange rates. And so to me, this is intriguing. We could actually get some more formal economics and to try to understand risk premium and the like. So I was hoping this is a way to do things like estimate the risk aversion parameter. And,
yes, that's right. So we were, I think my comments earlier were reflecting a lot of the debate that was going on in the macro community about whether a simple model with aggregate consumption, constant relative risk averse preferences, without all the frictions that people might have in mind when they work with other representations of macro models that aren't derived explicitly from starting with preferences and budget constraints, et cetera, and having a debate about the merits of looking at these somewhat stylized but more complete and formal models versus representations of models that start somewhere along a path that are that attempts at capturing what's going on with frictions without all the formality of preferences, et cetera. Mm-hmm. In the finance community, my recollection was that we were the work was circulating, and as you point out, the finance community was coming at things a little bit differently, but they were beginning to look not only at the cross section but mixing cross section and time series. They were beginning to look at moments, and
Breeden's paper was
was very much out there and was very influential for us. But on the empirical side of finance, I don't think that literature had caught up with Breeden in terms of what was going on the empirical side. So there was the beginnings of a discussion and dialogue, trying to, I think from our point of view, trying to understand the motivation and interest of the finance community and what the issues they were looking at in their cross-sectional framework, and we trying to explain the role of conditioning and how to think about some of what they're doing, mixing time series and cross-section, and how some of what we were working on might be useful. So I remember, for example, early discussions with Mike Gibbons about what we were doing versus what he was doing, how the two were related to each other, were complementary to each other, and each could borrow from the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The relative to Mera and Prescott, what eventually became the sort of debate between calibration versus estimation, was that going on when you were here, or that is, was this a kind of ideological divide?
I think a lot of that got sharper a little bit down the road. More it started gaining steam more like in the mid '80s and on, in the sense of. So prior to our work, there had been a lot of very interesting work done by Tom Sargent and others about, well, let's figure out how to think about these dynamic stochastic models as restrictions on likelihood functions. Let's try to figure out how to look at the full-blown model and go through and test all the restrictions. And that was and there were not a lot of empirical successes attached to that, and that led people to be saying, well, maybe maybe we don't want to be so formal with statistics. And I guess in part what Ken and I were about was, well, maybe we can think about portions of models without tying our hands in all the rest of them. So I think of these as kind of partially specified models in a sense, allowing robustness elsewhere. So we hoping that would somehow help, and so that we wouldn't have to do everything before we had to do something. But it's my feeling that the kind of more negative views in macroeconomics towards econometrics really evolved later as there's this notion that there's this powerful set of tools and models after Kidlin and Prescott's paper that ought to be useful, and we don't want to be derailed by thinking too hard about likelihood ratio statistics and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. That there ought to be other ways that we ought to look at these models there from other vantage points, and I think that kind of evolved much more towards the mid to late '80s than when we were doing our stuff.
Here there was more at the time you were doing your work. There was more of a shared missionary zeal for just taking quantitative models seriously.
Yeah, absolutely.
Data.
But exactly what the right way to do it, or the best way to do it was I don't think was settled in anybody's mind. Of course, it's not settled today either. But
I think there was.
I think it was maybe a little bit more eclectic maybe at the outset. But
there was a shared mission. There were different perspectives. There was debate. I mean, people would wander into each other's offices and argue, some over the choice of parameters and whether moment conditions were more informative than some more informal way of picking parameters to plug into models, and what do you and how to interpret differences, answers. So I think Lars is right. I think the intensity of the discussion sort of picked up somewhat later in the 80s, but the beginnings of that debate were certainly present in a friendly, if not spirited, dialogue in hallways and in offices.
So, Lars, you ended up in a great economics department. Ken, you ended up in a great business school. I'm often talking to young scholars about this choice. Okay? What, Lars, why do you think it's better to be in an economics department? Because you've surely
an economics department.
It
kind of depends on which economics department you're talking about, I suppose. I think different people have obviously have different talents and attributes and stuff that interest them. For me, I've really had great luck advising over the years a lot of graduate students, PhD students, and so I'm at a department where the teaching orientation is there's a lot of emphasis on the PhD program, and it's a fairly sizable program as well. And that's something that I think has worked well for me. I have close ties with many of the people in the Chicago Business School, and that's also very important to me being happy at Chicago. So I'm not sure I can definitively say you ought to be in an economics department and not a business school. But,
And Ken, you like being in a business school? Right?
I do like being in a business school. I mean, I think just to amplify, Lars has this wonderful circumstance where he's the business school of Chicago would love to have him, and so he has an office there, and he can move comfortably back and forth between the two. So it's a really ideal setup for him there at Chicago. I think that's a unique circumstance where business schools and economics departments are so closely tied together and are collaborating so much across when they're physically separate. They are separate at Stanford. The business school has a very strong economics group, but I guess I sort of migrated. I don't have strong feelings about being in an economics department or a business school either, actually. I think I would be comfortable in both environments. I think being in a business school has been very influential in my research over the years, in the sense that I'm sitting in a finance group, I'm pulled in the direction of some of the traditional questions asked in finance and the frameworks and methodologies used to address those questions. And I've been happy to have my interests and research pulled in that direction over the years, while still trying to keep close ties to my economics colleagues on the macro side. The teaching is different, and I think that's a matter of just sort of personal interest, taste, comfort as to how much people want to get engaged with thinking about applications that the more managerial side of an MBA program calls upon versus an undergraduate program. But I think they both offer rich environments, and then it comes down, as Lars is suggesting, to school-by-school comparisons and where you find comfort home. Our PhD program is very small relative to an economics department, but also has been very good and very successful. So that's a very important feature of the program for me, and that differs a lot across business schools. So it's personal preferences, I guess.
I mean, the one nice thing about the Chicago Economics Department that I think has been special, and it was shared with Carnegie Mellon as well, is there's lots of interactions across areas. So for me, I get a lot out of talking to Jim Heckman about labor economics and to Gary Becker about a variety of issues. It's I found it to be very useful to be exposed to a wide variety of economics. But I'm not sure that's true in all economics departments. So that's why it's really hard to give a definitive statement about you ought to do one or the other.
Okay.
Thank you for talking with us today and sharing the delightful insights about the process and progress of producing research with such a wide-ranging impact. And I'd like to thank you again and enjoy the conference.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you very much.
Very nice.